Hi Dan, how you doing?
Hello, Alexander. Welcome. And welcome,
Good to be
everyone.
here.
I'm Dan Powers, Executive Director of the Society for Science and User Research Facilities. And welcome. This is another session during our 2021 annual meeting. An insightful interview is about to happen regarding how federal research facilities are funded, led by Alexander Ratner. Alexander leads federal policy outreach activities and develops strategic direction on federal policy for the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Prior to joining the energy efficiency community, Alexander served the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce as a policy analyst for the Energy and Environment subcommittees. Alexander is a 2021 Clean Energy Leadership Institute Fellow and holds a Juris Doctor degree from DePaul University College of Law and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the George Washington University. Alexander has been asked to give the SURF network a sense of the government processes and timelines and larger forces that shape federal government investment into science. Thank you, Alexander. Let me turn this over to you, and I'll mute myself, but look to comment or ask questions as you get wrapped up.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Dan, and good afternoon, SURF members. As Dan just said, my name is Alexander Ratner, and I'm the Federal Policy Manager for the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. We're a nonprofit research organization that develops policies to reduce energy waste and combat climate change. ACEEE was founded a little over 40 years ago by leading energy researchers to conduct independent analysis on energy use and to advocate for increased energy efficiency. Since then, and I like to think in part based on our efforts, the United States has halved its energy use relative to the size of the economy. My own background, of course, as Dan went over, is that I'm a lawyer by training with over a decade of work on federal issues. Most recently as an advocate, but previously as a congressional staffer, and before that as an employee of the Department of Commerce and the National Archives and Records Administration. Of course, most relevant to today's discussion, I served Chairman Frank Pallone and the Democratic members of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce as a policy analyst for the Energy and Environment subcommittees. So I'm happy to get started, Dan, unless you have any follow-up.
No, actually, thanks for your additional introduction. And now let's get right to what we would need to know. And for the audience, know when Alexander and I had spoken before, I was reiterating to him the kind of questions and a bit of just the general curiosity that many scientists had about how funding comes to their given laboratory or starting at a higher level to different federal agencies, and how it seemed to be either stilted or would happen at different times, or that large amounts or certain financial information would be put out and they would hear in the media, and yet that didn't seem to be what would come about towards the end. And I knew that Alexander's insights and his experience on Capitol Hill could help describe a bit more of the process. And that would just be some information that our network could be a bit more informed about, perhaps not as surprised on how things ultimately end up turning out when it comes to science funding.
Absolutely. So before I get started today, I want to set a couple of broad principles for my talk. And the way that I'm going to frame a lot of this is in terms of the congressional appropriations process, because most of the funding that comes through the federal government, and I think probably all of the funding that comes before user facilities comes through this process. So first, my knowledge of the appropriations process comes from practicing in Congress and as an advocate in the frankly more than somewhat messy landscape of the modern appropriations process. So in order to give a more stable framework to this knowledge, I've consulted an excellent report from the Congressional Research Service entitled The Congressional Appropriations Process, an Introduction. That was published in 2016. If you're interested in a more detailed breakdown of the process, I highly recommend this report. Some of the things in the Congressional Budget Act in it are not going to be current, but the general framework of it is very solid. Second, the elephant in the room when dealing with anything in the federal government these days is the growing polarization and confrontational partisanship have warped a lot of these processes from the way they were originally intended to work. I'm certainly going to address this as it relates to procedural matters, but I'm going to try and stay away from attempting to characterize the actions of either party in this context. So this all starts with the congressional appropriations cycle, and this is how things are supposed to work. Congress annually considers several appropriations measures which provide discretionary funding for numerous activities. For example, research and development of the Department of Energy, as well as general government operations. Technically, Congress is required to pass these measures every year by October 1st to fund the government. We'll get to how that doesn't always happen a little bit later. The rules and practices for the consideration of appropriations measures are referred to as the Congressional Appropriations process. Appropriations measures fall under the jurisdiction of two congressional committees split across the chambers. They are the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee. In the modern era, these appropriations measures have accounted for just over a third of total federal spending. The rest of federal spending is either direct mandatory spending controlled by the House and Senate legislative committees or net interest in the public debt. There are three types of appropriations measures that we'll talk about today. They are the regular appropriations bills, continuing resolutions, and supplemental appropriations bills. I mentioned committees a few moments ago. For the purpose of the Department of Energy's funding writ large, and more specifically for funding of DOE's user facilities, the committees, or rather subcommittees, that matter the most in the funding process are the respective energy and water development subcommittees of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. When discussing authorizations, the following committees exercise some level of jurisdiction over DOE and its user facilities and how they can use funds. In the House of Representatives, that'll be the Committee on Energy and Commerce and the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. I don't know if any of you have worked with House staff before. The jurisdictional combat between those two committees over who has what in DOE can sometimes be pretty fierce. But in the Senate, it's the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Technology, and the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. The annual appropriations cycle begins with the president's budget submission, which is due on the first Monday of February, although this is usually substituted by a less formal document or pushed back in the first year of a new president's term. And Congress can provide deadline extensions in statute and also informally. This year, President Biden's fiscal year 2022 budget request was not released until June. The president recommends spending levels for various programs and agencies of the federal government in the form of budget authority, or BA. This authority is not cash. Instead, it refers to the authority provided by federal law to enter into contracts or other financial obligations that will result in the expenditure of federal funds. After the president submits the budget proposal to Congress, each agency provides additional detailed justification materials to the congressional committees with jurisdiction over its funding. There's a big caveat with the president's budget submission, and that's that it's really just a guidance document. Congress can, and it most often does, largely ignore its specifics and only follows it in the broadest brushstrokes, and usually only when both chambers are in partisan alignment with the White House. I frequently found the submission of the president's budget to be a frustrating time in Washington because everyone goes into a frenzy over what is included or what is cut, and staff and advocates spend a lot of time messaging on it. In the end, though, this document rarely bears much resemblance to the final appropriations bills for that year. So if you happen to hear about something harmful to your facility or helpful in the president's budget, take it with more than a grain of salt. The next step in the process after the president's budget is in hand, and Congress has thoroughly ignored it, is for Congress to adopt a budget resolution. This is effectively Congress's response to the president's budget, and it sets spending ceilings for the congressional committees. This is also called a concurrent resolution because it's an agreement between the chambers of Congress that establishes overall budgetary policy to be carried out through subsequent legislation. While this resolution is an important part of the process that sets up eventual spending bills, and it can be informative if you're really trying to get a sense of what Congress is thinking during the budget process and how funding might go, it's important to know that the budget resolution is also just a guide for the House and the Senate that sets some rules internally about what they can do. The budget resolution is not sent to the president, and it does not become law. The budget resolution is supposed to be completed by April 15th, but this frequently does not happen. This year, the House took until August 24th to pass its budget resolution. Sometimes Congress does not even adopt a budget resolution. There's no penalty if the resolution is late or is not passed, but there are some procedural irregularities that can happen if it is not. And without getting too far into the weeds, each chamber can adopt something called a deeming resolution that addresses those and allows the process to move forward. That, in fact, did happen this year. After the budget resolution is passed or Congress just decides to start moving ahead anyway, the chambers will begin consideration of the 12 regular appropriations bills. I'm not going to list them out here because each one of them covers roughly 4 topics and it'd take a long time, but I can tell you that the bill most germane to this group is the Energy and Water Development and Related Agencies bills. Other bills that could be interesting to the group, particularly those who are involved in energy research, are Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies. That's one bill. And also Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies. That's also just one bill. Timing for the appropriations process is pretty variable, but there are some patterns to look out for. Traditionally, the House began consideration of the regular appropriations measures, and the Senate then followed and amended the House-passed bills. In recent years, the Senate Appropriations Committee has often not waited for the House bills and instead pressed ahead with original Senate bills. The first step in the consideration of the 12 regular appropriations bills for the House and Senate committees is to hold hearings on the segments of the budget under their jurisdiction. They often begin their work from the agency budget justifications that accompany the president's budget submission, but they pretty quickly amend those numbers to suit their own priorities. The committees also often reach out to their counterparts on the authorizing committees, and for our purposes right now, that's most of the other legislative subject matter-based committees. They reach out to them for input on program funding levels and legislative language to be included in bills and their accompanying reports. In the spring, usually probably more like the early summer for the Senate, the appropriations subcommittees hold hearings on these bills where they provide the opportunity for public witness testimony. Any member of the public can submit testimony to the committee by following procedures on its website. This testimony is not read aloud at the hearing, but it does become part of the hearing record, and it is available to members of the committee and their staff as they work on their bills. After conducting hearings, the appropriations committees begin to draft the language of the 12 regular appropriations bills. When they are finished drafting, the subcommittees mark up their individual bills and report them to the full committees. Markup confused me a lot when I first came to the Hill. It's the markup is the term that congressional committees use to describe a business meeting, which is usually public, where a subcommittee or committee debates, amends, and votes on a bill. When a subcommittee votes to advance a bill to the full committee, that is called reporting the bill. And when a full committee follows suit at its own markup and votes to send a bill to the House or Senate floor, it also reports the bill. So that's, what you call it when the committee passes the bill.
Alexander, could I jump in here with a question?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm curious, when we had spoken before, how we were discussing the strategy around timing, or just an awareness of the timing for commenting and becoming more involved in where the process is before final decisions are made.
Mhm.
So, given where you are getting into the process right now, particularly around the markup, are
Sure.
markup meetings and hearings when a lot of the details have already been figured out and people should have
Hearings
been in
are a good
conversation
time to
prior?
influence. Hearings are a good time to influence the process. You can submit that public testimony. That's a good way to do things. You can also reach out to members of the appropriation subcommittees and to the committee staff. Um, Usually there's either an email on their website to do that, or you can have someone who is a constituent of a particular subcommittee member who's a SSURF member call that office. They're usually quite responsive to their own constituents, um, and set up meetings to discuss what you think would be important priorities that way. So the hearing stage is a good time to get involved. Generally, by the time that the bill is at markup, unless you're a little more sophisticated in working with individual offices to prepare amendments, it could be late. And then you're not you're dealing with a bill that's been baked to some extent, and you're talking about how do we change it. So it's a different procedural level. It's a little harder than doing things at the hearing stage, but hearings are the best time to get involved, or even sort of before the hearings if you want to set up meetings earlier in the year, to talk with members. Hey, what are your priorities? These are what our priorities are. That's the way that we engage sometimes.
All right, thank you. And I'll
Sure. Yeah,
save further
absolutely.
questions till the end.
After conducting hearings, the appropriations committees begin to draft the language of the 12 regular appropriations bills. When they're finished drafting, the subcommittees, oh, wait, that's what I already read. In the House of Representatives, floor consideration of an appropriations bill is almost always preceded by a special rule from the House Rules Committee that that sets the parameters for what happens on the House floor. The House considers appropriations bills in the Committee of the Whole House of the State of the Union, which is more commonly referred to as the Committee of the Whole. And all representatives of the House are members of that. The special rule usually sets 1 hour for general debate and sets limits on what kinds of amendments may be considered. After the Committee of the Whole completes consideration of the bill, it reports legislation and any amendments to the full House, which is the same group of people. They're just in a different procedural outfit, so to speak. The House then votes on amendments, followed by final passage of the bill, assuming that it has passed. And usually the Speaker and the Majority Leader are not going to permit the bill to come to a vote on the floor if it's not going to pass. This is, if you've heard of a whip or a whip operation, that's, what they'll run to figure out who among the membership of Congress is voting in what way on that bill. And if they think it looks like it's going to go down, they'll hold it still in, either committee process or in floor debate. They're not going to let the bill go down because that looks embarrassing to the majority. So once it's passed, the bill is then sent to the Senate. The Senate really has two options for consideration of appropriations. First, it can take up consideration of the House bill, as was traditionally the practice, and amend that bill. Second, as has often been the case in recent years, the Senate can consider its own bills that come up from its subcommittees in much the same method. Hearing, subcommittee markup, full committee markup that I just described for the House. The Senate usually tries to have its appropriations bills passed by the end of July. That's before the August recess. I have a lot of miserable staffers if that doesn't happen. And usually at this point in the process, unless you're looking for an amendment to a bill that solves a specific member's problem that they have with it, it's generally too late to get too involved as an outside stakeholder. The Senate does not have a device like the House's special rule to limit debate on the floor. It can, however, choose to set parameters for consideration by unanimous consent. The Senate does have some standing rules and precedents that it must follow, in addition to being subject to the congressional budget process. Assuming that the Senate bill passes, the next step in the process is for the House and Senate to enter a conference. The Constitution requires that both chambers approve the same measure in the same form before it may be submitted to the president. It will surprise probably none of you to learn that the chambers do not pass identical bills during their individual processes. At this point, there are two options. First, the chambers can convene a conference committee that's made up of members from both chambers, usually from the appropriations committees, to resolve differences between the bills. And second, they may reach an agreement through an exchange of amendments between the chambers. Unlike most other parts of the process, conference committees can be very closed off processes in which the public doesn't really have much sense of what's going on in them at all. I took part in a few conference committees for authorizing bills in my time working for Congress. They typically resolve as a chain of seemingly interminable meetings between staff where they read the bills over and over again and try to come to some form of agreement on a version for final passage, usually by hoping that somebody else capitulates. Conferees are not permitted to include any new directed spending provisions in their finished work product. So if both the House and the Senate have passed their bills, any new provisions that are in there, those are the only new provisions for directed spending that are going to be in there. The conference committee is not gonna add anything. When an agreement is reached, the conference committee produces a report. This does become public that proposes a new substitute for the bill as a whole. There's no timeline for this to be done. It's finished only when and if the conferees can find an agreement. Conference reports may not be amended by either chamber. Usually the House considers the conference report substitute first. It can adopt the report, reject it, or recommit it to the conference for further consideration. After the first chamber adopts the report, the conference committee is disbanded, and the second chamber can either adopt or reject the measure, but they can't recommit. After the chambers agree on and pass a substitute appropriations bill, it is presented to the president. As set forth in the Constitution, the president has 10 days to sign or veto the bill. If they take no action, it automatically becomes law after 10 days, unless they take no action when Congress is adjourned, and then the bill is pocket vetoed. If the president vetoes the bill, then it's sent back to Congress. Congress may override the veto by a 2/3 vote in both houses. If the veto is overridden, the bill becomes law. If not, it dies. So that more or less covers the typical appropriations process, but as I noted earlier, nothing is really typical anymore. The 12 subject matter appropriations bills are referred to as regular appropriations bills. One thing that can happen to these bills as they advance in the process is that Congress can combine some or all of them into what's called an omnibus appropriations. This just means that the bill covers more than one of the 12 regular bills, and it is often a measure taken to ensure more efficient passage of some or all of the included bills. It can be easier to get votes, especially in the Senate, for a package of bills that covers priorities many senators in the individual bills, which may lack a thing that a given senator or their constituents care about. Sometimes an omnibus appropriations bill that covers only a few of the 12 regular bills will be referred to as a minibus. Continuing resolutions are the next type of appropriations, and as far as I'm concerned,
could I jump in for a moment?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
5 minutes left here, and I want to be sure, yes, the CRs are something that are explained. And I wonder if you could give a context to the recent infrastructure bill that the House passed, and if that needs to be going into one of the reconciliation.
Sure, processes. Absolutely. So the recent infrastructure bill it's an expanded version of a 5-year transportation funding bill that Congress usually considers. It's sort of a hybrid authorizations bill that also adds in spending. Um, it doesn't follow through the appropriations process. It kind of has its own timeline, although it does follow the same hearing, subcommittee markup, full committee markup, floor schedule.
And in this case, the House passed what the Senate had passed earlier in the summer.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, as you know, as you noted, that bill began in the Senate. And really that kind of bill had to begin in the Senate because it was sort of a negotiated thing between senators to make sure that they had 60 of them so that they wouldn't come down with a filibuster.
All right. Well, what might affect many of the members of SSURF and the audience today would be whether there's a continuing resolution in early
Yep.
December.
Yep.
Please discuss that.
So yeah, as I was getting into, the continuing resolutions are a big part of the modern appropriations process because a lot of times Congress has trouble passing the regular appropriations bills. This year, as many of you, of course, know, Congress blew through its FY 2022 funding deadline of October 1st, and the most recent funding bill, the one in effect now, is a continuing resolution passed on October 4th. General federal budget authority expires at the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. If regular appropriations that cover a given department, program, or activity are not completed by October 1st, then it must cease any non-accepted activities due to lack of budget authority. This is what the press means when it talks about a government shutdown. Note, if some regular appropriations bills pass and others do not, then there can be a partial shutdown. The last time that all of the regular appropriations bills passed before the deadline was 1996, for the bills covering FY 1997. On or before the start of the fiscal year, Congress and the President will coordinate to produce and pass an initial continuing resolution, or CR, that temporarily funds the outstanding regular appropriations bills. That's the October 4th bill. In contrast to regular bills that set specific program levels, so that fund, say, that look at funding for a particular user facility and say this facility should get X number of dollars. CRs usually continue funding programs from a previous year at some percentage of previous funding, a lot of times the same funding. They're also usually until a set date, and they'll continue until that date unless regular appropriations are passed or they're extended again. The current bill expires on December 3rd. Congress will either have to pass regular appropriations or they'll have to extend that CR. Sometimes Congress recognizes that the path to passage of the regular appropriations bill is simply too steep because of the immediate political landscape. In these instances, Congress can pass a full year CR that sets funding based on levels like the more common deadline CRs, but it covers a full fiscal year. And they just agreed to start the appropriation cycle again next year and to leave it for this one.
All right. Also Alexander, we just have a couple minutes. What next step or process do you think we should all be aware of given the status of a potential CR?
Sure. So December 3rd is the date to look to. Congress is going to have to do something by then. Unfortunately, at this point, there's not a lot of good opportunities to influence that process other than sort of to speak to your members of Congress and say, it's very important for us that we have a regular appropriations bill, and that I assume that members of SSURF are not particularly interested in seeing a full year CR, that generally the individual funding levels and appropriations bills are better. So, that's certainly a message that can be conveyed to members. It doesn't serve anyone for the government to have a big shutdown this winter. So they're going to be, I think, looking to do either either regular appropriations bills or a full year CR. And I know that it's just working through these things and in the context of reconciliation.
All right. Well, that's a semi-hopeful final point to end on, but actually very clear, and it's the realistic outlook as to what could be the decisions made for funding. Ideally, we will have full appropriations approved as opposed to a continuing resolution. Uh, let's see, I do have one comment was put into the chat here.
Sure, I see from Richard wondering how many facilities are line items in the budget. I know that, so I don't actually know all the facilities that exist myself. My experience is from the energy and commerce side. I usually dealt with the Department of Energy at the department level and then at the office level. So, but I do know that there are facilities that are line items in the budget. And I assume that for any that aren't, that they're receiving funding through allocations to a particular DOE office or lab.
Well, thank you for giving us this input today. And I appreciate those in the audience who tuned in to hear a bit more of getting into the weeds in the process of government scientific funding. This is not what everyone's interested in, but it actually does help to have the context and understand where decisions being made by politicians influence what becomes the funding streams to support your science. Thanks for this background, Alexander. And how might people reach you if they would like to just have a further policy decision, policy discussion?
Oh, sure. Yeah. If you're interested in federal funding or in clean energy, energy efficiency in general, you can reach me at Ratner at ACEEE. That is RATNER at ACEEE.org. And yeah, I'd be happy to hear from you and to work together. I know on the energy side there is a lot to do.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much, Alexander.
Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone. We have another session coming up in a few minutes, and I'll stay in touch with you on the other side. Alexander, you've prompted a couple more questions that I have. I'll follow
Sounds
up.
good. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thanks, everybody. See you at the next session.